Our concluding panel is going to concern the Colorado Conservation Board, and not that there is concern, but changes afoot in so many ways and places, and it's certainly taking place at the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and that's why we put John in the middle so that his colleagues can discipline him. But we have a new director of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. Her name is Becky Mitchell, and she'll come up here in a minute and give us an overview of what she's thinking about, the priorities of the Conservation Board are. And then we'll have discussions on that subject by John McClow, who represents the Gunnison Basin, and Heather Dutton, a relatively new member this year, as is Becky, promoted this year, and Heather represents the Rio Grande Basin. So a lot of folks know that James Eklund was the previous director. He's been a frequent guest here, but he moved on. And what the Conservation Board did was look inward to current staff with institutional knowledge and knowing what the priorities are, and they found Becky. And a lot of us think that's a pretty good choice. And because Becky had a lot to do with the Colorado Water Plan, and of course the roundtables were involved with that. But really, I'd like Becky, for you to do the talking, so I don't even know if you're going to show a PowerPoint.
All right.
I guess not. You're in luck.
Great. My boss told me I had to stay seated, so which is better because then I can kick him if I need to.
Well, yeah, the boss.
I think better standing, but it's okay, John. So first of all, I'm Becky Mitchell, and I'm the new 2-month-old director of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And I think touching on a little bit about what's said throughout the day, and then just in the introduction, really focusing on the priorities of the CWCB and what we're doing. A lot of it was already spoken about here today, so we're going to touch on a little bit more of that. But for folks who are not familiar with CWCB, I hope you are, but our agency is not just a piggy bank, and I think that that's important to recognize. Oftentimes the way we're seen out in the public is as it's associated with money, but I want to make sure that we recognize we have a competitive loan program with really great interest rates, and then a grant program that really helps folks on the ground get implementation of the water plan done. But beyond that, the agency is 45 really passionate and capable, reliable people with various backgrounds that do more than just the funding side. We have 6 programmatic sections that work on things like in-stream flows and drought and flood protection and long-range planning and the funding and finance piece, but also a component is the interstate and federal section and how we protect the entire state of Colorado and keep an eye out on what's happening in other states and make sure that we're using our compacts and protecting Colorado in every way that we can. So CWCB is the primary water policy and project financing agency, and so you've probably seen us in that way on more than one occasion. But as we step into this characterization of Colorado's water challenges, I think it's really important to focus on what we've always relied on as the solution, and that's that collaboration piece and how we move forward together, and how we pull people in this room together. Not we. When I say we, the CWCB, we didn't pull the people in this room together, but actually the River District pulled these people in the room together, but we are a part of that in solution and working together. So we started off today with some really high impact seminars, drought contingency planning, and then we ended on that artistic side, which all of that is important as we look forward. And what I hope we gather here today from that seminar is that, or from this whole entire day, is that it's really an all hands on deck. Everyone here plays an important role, and the folks sitting next to me are going to get into a little more detail about what we're doing, but what you're doing is as equally important as anything that we're doing, because the top priority is to ensure that Colorado has adequate water to meet all of Colorado's water needs. And I think that's important to everyone sitting here, regardless of what your need is. So I feel honored as I sit in this role, a little bit cautiously optimistic, nervous, scared. But why I feel honored is because as I sit here today and I hear about all of this, I think we're at a point, at a critical time where we have the ability to make some progress. I don't want to say that with naivete that is, oh, Pollyanna, and we can solve all the world's problems. There have been some steps that have been taken, not just at the CWCB, but at the River District, on the ground, at the Basin Roundtables, with the environmental stakeholder groups, with the ag folks, that have really shown me that we are at a point where we're ready to work together, and that the success that we've had has been because of collaboration. So I don't say that without a healthy amount of concern for that the water future propels me to move forward, and that the concerns that I have are what propel us to move forward. So I'm gonna introduce Heather and John, and Heather's really going to focus on talking about some of the board's work and interstate issues. You know, we work both interstate and intrastate, and Heather has a really active and critical role on her Basin Roundtable, the Rio Basin Roundtable, and really has put a lot of focus on implementation of projects, specifically in the Rio, but now across the state in her role. So I'm going to let her focus on that, and then I'm going to pass it on to John.
Awesome. So as was mentioned, I represent the Rio Grande, the mighty Rio Grande, which I realize the evaporation of Lake Mead and Lake Powell is one Rio Grande. So that's kind of crazy in context. So I think I'm definitely part of, I think, the later theme of the day, that the roundtables, while we get a lot of great work done and it's a bunch of people that come together with a lot of technical ideas, it's also the very artistic side of water, and people that maybe before the roundtables were created would see each other at the co-op or at coffee, or buying a tractor tire or something. But now we spend time together once a month, and then through the Basin Implementation Plan, it really forced us to spend a lot of time together. And I can be honest that in the beginning of the Basin Implementation Plan process, I think that a lot of us were saying, well, why do we need to make a document? We know what our priorities are. But having the framework from CWCB and the instructions to put together a plan that could then be folded into the greater water plan was really powerful, and it gave us an opportunity to have some conversations that I don't think we had really had before, or maybe to work out some framework for how to implement some ideas that people had been talking about but had never quite figured out how to do. Some of those are, right now we're working on some pretty cool coordination of putting water in the river at times of the year when the fish really need it, without having to do any kind of formal agreements or water changes. And my buddy Kevin from Trout Unlimited was here earlier, but had to head out because he's got to go fishing. So but he's brought people together and helped us figure out, well, I run a group augmentation plan for the Sandless Valley Water Conservancy District. So is there flexibility in the timing of our augmentation release, where rather than just putting it in the river to meet well depletions, can we also put it in the river during a time that helps for winter flows for brown trout? That seems so simple and so straightforward, but we hadn't quite put the pieces together. And I think that the roundtable process and just spending time together and building trust was a huge part of projects like that coming to fruition. And of course, just like all of you, we're doing a ton of irrigation improvement projects and studies, and just trying to figure out how can we maximize the benefits for our water users, and then those uses such as fish and boats that maybe don't have a formal water right. So it's been really, really exciting to be a part of it was also noted that maybe I could talk about my experience with, we'll call it passing the torch. You may notice, Jim, I'm a millennial. I don't know if anyone noticed.
I'm not sure.
Not sure, but I'm gonna be bold and throw it out there. I'm a pretty excitable person. I get excited about tiramisu at lunch. I get excited about partnerships and creativity and cool projects. But when I first kind of came on the scene, I think it was apparent to those around me. They realized how excitable I am, but fortunately, they knew and I knew that excitement alone, it doesn't lead to effectiveness. And so through the roundtable process and then just by some really gracious, kind, and patient people, I've been fortunate to have the experience of having some really, really great mentors. I'm starting obviously with my dad, who's a lifelong farmer and who was on the board of the San Luis Valley Water Conservancy District for 22 years. Before I became the manager, so I would be remiss not to mention that guy. He's pretty cool. Through the roundtable, I got to know some of our local water legends. I would mention specifically Steve Vandiver, for example. He dedicates his water congress drives to carpooling with me and explaining the Rio Grande Compact, river administration, and notable court cases. So no, it's not all gossip about who's doing what. At one point, he turned to me and said, look, if I'm going to mentor you, you have got to figure this out. And I didn't even know he was my mentor, so that was cool. But it's incredibly powerful to have these friendship and the firsthand knowledge of these events. An example from Steve is, I had read about the spill at Elephant Butte, which was pretty tremendous for those of us on the Rio Grande. Well, the people that live on the Rio Grande, I wasn't around yet. There was a portion where we had gone into some pretty big debt and hadn't been paying our obligation to New Mexico with very good regularity. And so when Elephant Butte Reservoir spilled, that erased this huge debt. You're saying, cool, Heather, wow, that was pretty interesting. Reading in a book, you get it and you say, okay, that was cool. It spilled the year I was born. I'll remember that date. But Steve was there. So in addition to telling me about the events that led up to it, his role as the division engineer, the work they did with river administration and people all working together to spill that reservoir. And then on top of it, he'll tell you about how he almost got escorted off the dam because he was part of a group lighting fireworks off of it. That's the kind of story you remember. and so, those are the things that'll get imprinted in somebody's mind, and hopefully, I think I made it pretty clear, I'm not gonna forget that one. But joking aside, I would make a plea that I've made before in groups like this, that for the young, the new, the curious, please spend time with those more seasoned people, because I would bet you an ice cream cone that they are pretty excited to tell you their stories and to kind of pass the torch. And seasoned experts, come on, I just bet an ice cream cone. So please spend time with the young and the new and the curious. And we want to know your stories. We want to understand how things work behind the hydrologic and the administrative curtain. And so, I strongly believe that in order for us to keep moving forward and to keep doing work that protects the communities and the rivers that we love, we need to spend this time getting to know each other. So. Sure.
I'm pretty sure you all know John McClow, as he's been protecting the interests of everyone in this room for a little bit, I think, with his work on the Colorado River Compact and everything associated with that. So I think we should go right to him to talk about some interstate issues.
Thank you, Becky. And I'm not a millennial, by the way, so I'll throw that out right at the beginning. You heard in bits and pieces today a lot of conversation about what's going on in the Colorado River, both from the lower basin and the upper basin perspectives. And the Colorado Water Conservation Board is very active in that process. The Upper Colorado River Commissioner is the face of Colorado in dealing with the upper basin states, our sister states, and also the lower basin states and the United States and Mexico. But the Colorado Water Conservation Board staffs the commissioner, and our staff is his staff, and they do the heavy lifting. They do the research, they do the modeling, they meet with the staff of the other states, both the upper division and the lower division states. They meet with the federal entities and move forward Colorado's position to all of our benefit. So that's one of the many important things that the Water Conservation Board does. And in that effort, right now, and again, you've heard parts of this already, moving forward to prepare for renegotiation of the 2007 interim shortage guidelines, doing the research and the modeling to figure out what position both Colorado and then her sister states in the upper division must take on setting the new standards for the coordinated operation of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. A negotiation can't take place unless you have good information, a successful negotiation, and these folks are putting it all together. The Colorado River activities, we also have a team paired up with 3 members of the Attorney General's staff. So the 2 groups work in tandem to protect Colorado's interests in those interstate and international negotiations. Soon, probably by the end of this month, we will have signed the extension of Minute 319 to the Mexican Water Treaty of 1944. It's now called Minute 323, and it's important because it's an interpretation of the treaty that engages Mexico in sharing shortages on the Colorado River in a fashion that is dictated by a formula and by some Lake Mead elevations, and allows us to better manage, us being the United States, better manage Lake Mead levels. Managing Lake Mead is important for us because it's connected to Lake Powell. That minute is scheduled to be signed on the 26th of this month in Mexico. And then there are a series of support agreements among the states and between the divisions that all the state representatives will be signing the next day in Santa Fe. All of those negotiations and discussions were essentially conducted by the team between the interstate section of the Colorado Water Conservation Board and the Attorney General's office. The commissioner has ultimate authority, but the hard work, in my opinion, is being done by the CWCB staff. We're also participating in the experimental programs. The System Conservation Pilot Program, which was mentioned earlier today, is going to roll over into 2018. And we provide staffing for that effort. No funding at this point, but we are participating, we being the board and the staff, are participating in the planning of the new iteration of that pilot program, which is where funding is provided to purchase temporarily water rights to create an emergency supply of water in the event of an extreme drought. Testing the concept of, if we put the money on the table, would irrigators or municipal users or industrial users be willing to forego the use of that water in exchange for monetary compensation? The objective being that if we have a crisis, and if we have to quickly diminish the consumptive use in the upper basin in order to avoid a compact deficit, where would the water come from? How much would it cost? And who would be willing to contribute in exchange for the compensation? We haven't yet gotten to the point of figuring out how we get that water to Lake Powell, but that'll be the next step in the process. The total contingency planning effort, in addition to those pilot programs, is to develop a plan that includes some additional supplementation of supply, and that's cloud seeding, whether you are supportive of that or not. We get a lot of money from the lower basin states to perform that effort, and the Colorado Water Conservation Board contributes a significant amount of money each year to that effort. The second part of that contingency plan among the upper division states is a coordinated operation of the upper basin reservoirs, Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, Navajo, in order to keep Lake Powell levels above the minimum power pool, which you heard Jack Schmidt talk about the effect of being below minimum power pool. And that planning is being done among the upper division states, but again, supported by the CWCB staff, who are doing the modeling and the legal drafting for those efforts. The lower basin is doing the same thing, and in partnership with the efforts among the upper division states, our folks are keeping the pressure on the lower basin to develop their drought contingency plan, because as Eric Kuhn showed us, the lower basin consumes more water than we deliver every year. So we're trying to keep them on track to get their plan finished as well. And I think that's a summary of our interstate activities. And going forward, that's what we will continue to do very actively.
All right, so, 2 minutes. So we've seen upper and lower basin perspectives on the big river issues today. We've seen ag producers working together to address irrigation trends and impacts. We've seen ranchers and recreational interests working together for stream health. We've also heard from the millennials about the need to pass the knowledge torch and different ways to look at things. So I think it's important before I only have 2 minutes left, so I wanted to just make sure to reassure folks that the CWCB is going to continue to work with all the basin roundtables, all the people on the ground that are doing the good work, because we know that's where the work is actually happening, is on the ground and in places like this. We're going to continue to protect the interests of the people of the state on both sides of the literal and figurative divide. And then I also wanted to commit that we'll continue to facilitate and be a part of the discussions and a part of the solutions. And I think that's probably the end of our time.
No, it's not.
We have questions, right?
Yeah. Well, Colorado is an interesting state in terms of how it executes water policy. We heard earlier this morning there's a California state project. There's no Colorado state project. We have a state water plan. We don't really have concerted funding. So there's challenges to executing some of the things that you've talked about, whether it's helping out with the myriad proposals that come forward from the roundtables, from storage to environmental. And, John talked about money, for demand management, paying people to send water down the river. So money seems to be a big challenge. That was a wide-ranging, I was just trying to create a difference between a place like California and a more locally organized state like Colorado, but nevertheless with a state board. So how do you see the CWCB threading through those issues?
Can I take this? Is that okay? So first of all, I think it's important that we look back to the basin roundtables and really say, is there a prioritization to these projects, and where do you see the most impact happening? And then as we look forward and through our statewide water supply initiative, we're going to get some costing analysis out of that. We know the numbers are large and what it's going to take, but where is the responsibility? It's not only the state's responsibility, it's not only the river district's responsibility, it's not only the ditch company's responsibility, it's how we come together. So we know what we have available to us through severance tax, and even though that fluctuates, we know that there's possibly going to be a need for more. So we're currently investigating different methods to generate additional financing and funding structures for the implementation of the projects that are happening on the ground. That's going to be an ongoing process, and it's not something that can happen in the silo of just the state. We're pulling in stakeholders to be a part of those discussions. We're pulling in people in this room to be a part of those discussions, but we know that those discussions are going to have to be broad and inclusive so that we can get the support that's needed.
Well, that said, you pulled millions of dollars out of the hat, so to speak, because there is this funding issue with severance taxes, and so then you created an extra $10 million fund. So we have a $10 million fund to do the known water supply reserve fund projects through the roundtables. Then you found an extra $10 million for more directed at water plan issues, and another $5 million plus for watershed planning and work. So that's not nothing, and that's pretty laudatory. But you want to talk about that?
I think we'll take a thank you. No, I think that it really goes back to the legislature to say that the work that was happening in not only the water plan, but on the basin implementation plans, I have to thank the legislature on that for seeing how important this work is. And so that is it's also important to recognize that that was a temporary funding, a 3-year funding plan, that's not committed in perpetuity, that we're looking at that as a short-term solution to some of the severance tax concerns. So again, the work that we're doing now, both the CWCB and the people on the ground are going to have to influence the long-term funding and how the legislature looks at it and how we look at the total solution.
Yeah, pulling the money out of a hat, I think, is a poor characterization, Jim, but those were funds that we gleaned from other sources within the agency. But, as Becky points out, we simply propose a budget and the use of those funds, but the General Assembly has to approve it by passing the projects bill every year. And so we had to go then to our legislators and explain to them what we felt was the importance of Colorado's water plan, keeping the Water Supply Reserve Fund active, even though there's no severance tax money available for that now. And this watershed planning effort, we put a high significance on that in the plan, and somebody has to fund it or it won't happen. So the board unanimously came together to use funds from other sources within the agency to keep this ball rolling. We plan to do it for 3 years. This is 2018 will be the first. But again, we'll each year have to convince the General Assembly to pass the projects bill and allow us to use the money in that fashion.
And tapping into something that John said too, it really was, the motivation was really keeping the ball rolling, and that when you're pushing a boulder uphill, if you stop, you slide back a little bit, and it becomes harder to get that boulder moving again. And we knew that if we weren't able to keep that ball moving, it would be harder to pick up the pace.
So aside from money, what challenges do you see for the Conservation Board, Water Conservation Board moving forward?
Well, I think that all the things I described present challenges, but they're not new. There are nuances to them, and as has been said at least twice today, the Colorado River Compact, for example, is what the parties want it to be. And that changes over time. So we have to be able to maintain that flexibility and still stay within the framework of the law of the river. But the challenges remain the same until we solve them. And then a new one will arise right behind it. So going forward on focusing this on the Colorado River, because this is a Colorado River basin. We are active in other basins as well, by the way.
Yeah, well, which brings us back to the Rio Grande. We were talking a lot about agriculture earlier, and it seems like ag is still big in the Rio Grande, even though because of overuse of water resources, you had to create taxing districts to pay people not to produce. Nevertheless, I know I think a beef operation recently moved down there from the Carbondale area. And there seems to be a little nucleus of young farmers who are entering the profession in your area. So I don't know, as while we have you, maybe we could talk about that a little bit.
Oh, okay.
What?
Getting mixed.
Are we almost out? Okay. Okay. Hey, this is live television. We can do it.
Yeah, so the Rio Grande is a really great place to live because it is a primarily agriculture-based area. We don't live there for healthcare or shopping or going to plays. We live there because my house is 15 minutes from 13ers. So it's a phenomenal place. Agriculture is still the #1 economy in the valley, although recreation is way up there. And I think that, again, the water plan helped us do some analysis where we really started to understand the benefit of the boating and fishing communities in the valley. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, we weren't forced to create taxing entities. We chose to, because the people of the valley recognized that we were using our aquifers at an unsustainable rate. And so rather than wait and just see how well administration would look and what that would do to our communities, we chose proactively to form groundwater management districts, and they're a sub-district of the Rio Grande Water Conservation District. So the people that have come together to form 7 different sub-districts are all in it together in this amazing experiment in self-governance. We're plowing new ground. I was visiting with a friend the other day, and she made the point that it's fascinating because how often is there something that's brand new? You know, what we're doing it's never been done in our area. It's never been done in, actually I think I heard in the US, just the type of scheme that we've come up with. And so it's a pretty emotional and interesting conversation, but it's really, I think it's outstanding to see that people have come together and they're voluntarily taxing and putting economic disincentives on themselves in order to try to reduce groundwater pumping and encourage aquifer recharge so that hopefully we can get to a level that's sustainable. And then yeah, there are multi-generation family farms, there are people that have left and come back or people that have never left. And there's actually a lot of people that I went to high school with who are all back running their family farms. And so I think it makes us very hopeful that this responsible use and this creative self-governance will lead to a future for agriculture in the long term.
Great. Well, to our friends in the ag community, there is hope. So if there's not any more questions, okay, Chuck.
The roundtable committees were involved in analysis of a very large project, which was a pipe from Flaming Gorge. And you probably remember the name of Millionaire or something like that. And somehow those rates then were to transfer to the Front Range as to what that water was worth. And it appeared like there was actually a lot of interest in this project and the generation and pumping and all this kind of stuff. It was a little confusing because basically the roundtable committees did a lot of the analysis, and when it came down to the real, is this thing feasible, how much time should we spend interstately, it was a little bit perplexing as to what your board was doing and whether or not they had the authority to be the referee with the legislation and how that all worked. Could you kind of go back and tell us a little bit about futuristically how you'd look at some of these large projects?
Go right ahead.
I drew the short straw on this one. I think we're open to looking at all ideas, and Flaming Gorge was one of those. And as I heard Eric Kuhn speak this morning, I heard the conversation about transbasin diversions and how the Flaming Gorge is something that you look at with that lens to some level. One of the problems that the board had was a project proponent and how that moved forward. And as we looked at projects through the basin implementation plans and through SWASI and all the work that we were doing, if one of the first lenses that we look through is there a project proponent moving forward with a viable project? And so we struggled. I think it was an important thing to analyze, but it's stalled, and we haven't determined that it's in the best interest of the state to step up as the driver on it. And so it's not a idea that's off the table. It's just that it's not an idea that we're taking and running with at this point in time, and nobody has stepped up and said this is extremely important to us. That's not a private entity looking at financial interest for financial purposes. Thank you, Chuck.
No, Chuck, it wasn't politics. The study of that pipeline was proposed as a project to the board, and it was a very complex, costly project, just the study. And we had a hearing on that issue here in Grand Junction, as a matter of fact. It lasted 14 hours. We each received 2,000 emails in opposition to even funding the study. In the end, we decided on a compromise study that cost less. And then when we received the report from that committee, their recommendation going forward, we felt duplicated the efforts of the board staff and the IBCC, and that we didn't think we needed to add another layer to the analysis. The commission or committee, whatever you call it, did an excellent job of pulling together information that is still available if that project ever rears its head again. But we thought they had done their job and done it well, and we didn't need to go any further.
Any more questions? It looks not. Well, thank you. We have our new director from within. We have a new face totally from the Rio Grande. And we have John, who we really do appreciate all the work that you've put into defending Western Colorado interest in the interest of all of Colorado. But yeah, John's been a big force with thorny roundtable issues, and we certainly appreciate what he brings to the table. And we look forward to the future work of Becky and Heather. So.